Hello, everybody. This lecture, we're continuing with epistemology, but we'll now turn our attention to empiricism. We talked about we talked about epistemology, but from the stance of the rationalist, and we focused our attention on Descartes, who tried to really dismantle the world, uh, eliminating all of the ideas he had about the world, trying to bring them back one at a time, purely with rationality. And so, if you'll remember, he talked about an evil deceiver who was always trying to trick him, as it were, so that he could guard against holding any beliefs that may not be true. So, the only things he would accept were absolute truths about the world. And so, he began with his cogito, the I think, therefore I am, talked about the existence of God and how the principle of sufficient reason would lead us to a creator that would not deceive us. But there were problems with this idea, with gaining an understanding of what it means to know something. And that is really that when we start with the I think, therefore I am, it's not quite clear that the I is really represented. We know that there is thought going on, but not necessarily that it's I that is doing the thinking. And this kind of first person perspective isn't very clear uh, from the rationality of I think, therefore I am. Secondly, he goes into the existence of God, claiming the principle of sufficient reason, and we talked about Aquinas and how really you need a initial causer to cause the motion and creation of the world. But is this principle of sufficient reason really something that we are not being deceived about? Descartes doesn't hold this up as something that could be questioned or thought to be a trick from the evil deceiver. And so he just kind of takes it at face value as truth when really he's not doing justice to this idea of an evil deceiver. If he's going to present an evil deceiver and only bring certain pieces of knowledge back, it's not quite clear that the principle of sufficient reason is necessarily fact, because we can see in instances now today where it may or may not be true. And so we're going to continue on, but this time I'll look at knowledge from a different perspective, the perspective of the empiricist. And so empiricism offers a concept of knowledge that differs from rationalism. And the way that it differs is that empiricism focuses on the experience of an individual, where we gain knowledge through our experience in the world. So empiricists claim that knowledge is a posteriori, which is that it arises through experience, versus a priori, which we talked about last week, and originates through just rationality. So for the empiricist, we actually have to exist in the world, experience information and events to learn. We can't necessarily do philosophy or understand the world from our armchair like Descartes was trying to do in his study. Instead, we need to go out, experience the world, use our sensations, read books, and do all of that stuff. And so for empiricism, if knowledge originates in experience, then we need to ask ourselves the obvious of, is what we experience absolute certainty in terms of what exists and how the world is? Because obviously we experience the world and we experience things that are tricks of the mind and play on our sensations. We mentioned last week this idea that if you put a stick in water, the stick looks bent, even though we know that it is straight. And so when we're dealing with our experiences, how do we know with absolute certainty that we're not being tricked? And so, John Locke, who we'll be focusing our attention on this week, the premier empiricist that we're going to be focusing on, comes up with kind of a few responses to this idea about knowledge and certainty and it being based on our experiences. And first, he's going to say that when it comes to uh, knowledge with a capital K, this absolute certainty knowledge, he's going to say that empiricists can't really absolutely and with certainty obtain knowledge. The knowledge they gain is kind of a lesser degree. And so for the empiricists, it seems as though we're already starting to set the bar a little lower in terms of what it takes for something to be considered knowledge. For the rationalist, knowledge was absolute, was certain. For the empiricists, not so much. And so we'll see as we go forward in this lecture that John Locke has a bit less to overcome than Descartes. And that perhaps means that he may be successful in some of your minds with convincing you that knowledge originates purely out of our experiences. Um, and so the empiricist is while an empiricist is going to use his or her rationality and obtain some things rationally, even those things require um, first understanding how to use reason and how to um, experience things in the world, whether they're stories or information, experiences from others, and so forth. A little background on John Locke. He was a philosopher in the 1700s and was constantly attacking the kind of rationalist belief that reason alone could provide us with this sense of knowledge. Locke thought that reason alone couldn't do that, and that we obviously needed experience in the world to gain knowledge. And there's going to be three aspects worth considering when we're looking at Locke in this lecture. First is his theory of ideas and how it is that we acquire ideas through our experiences and through using our senses. And then the distinction between primary and secondary qualities, because these are going to be differentiated by Locke. And then lastly, his account of how we can really know reality independent of our minds, because obviously, if we're experiencing the world through our sensations, then it's only really in our minds that we're gaining an understanding and knowledge base from this experience. But how is it that we really attach this understanding of our perception, what we see in our minds, with the actual thing that it is that we're experiencing? And so these three areas are going to be a main focus of this particular lecture. And so beginning with his theory of ideas, Locke's going to argue that we don't really have any innate ideas. There's nothing that we're born with. We're essentially born as a blank slate where everything that we learn is learned from our experience. And so when you're born, you watch your parents or television, you listen to your teachers and read stories, and from there you start to get an understanding of the world. You start to furnish your mind with all the different ideas of the world. And these ideas come in two basic forms, sensation and reflection. And these are the two ways in which we really start to understand the world. Beginning with sensation. Sensation is going to be that way in which we gain knowledge through our senses. So traditional senses of sight, sound, smell, touch, and taste. These things, these ways of experiencing the world are really going to give us our sense of an experience, but will create this bifurcation that Locke needs to deal with in terms of how we experience the world versus how the world is. And it's in this sensation aspect that we really start to see a development um, in our understanding of the world, moving from medieval time uh, to the more enlightened time period and scientific revolution. Think, for instance, of how we perceive things in terms of color, shape, pain, pleasure, warmth, and cold. But for something like color, particularly, it was once the case that we look at color and take that as a fact of the world. So, looking at an apple, for instance, you see a red apple, and we know that in the external world that apple is red, but we start to see a shift in our understanding of things like color. So instead, think of how you perceive a red apple and this apple being red, but now through the understanding that what color is essentially these wavelengths that just reflect off of the object. And so in the medieval era, we see the apple as being red and the object of the world is red, where now our perception of the apple is that it's red, but this isn't actually the innate characteristic of the apple. And so, uh, for Locke, sensation provides us with these ideas um, and these properties that we suggest that things have, but these ideas don't necessarily resemble the actual qualities of an object. And understanding this distinction is going to be an important part of the empiricist position and understanding why we can't set the bar as high as Descartes and the rationalists, because there's always going to be this kind of disconnect from what a thing actually has as a quality and what we can actually know about something versus what we just perceive about the thing. Now, our ability to gain an understanding and knowledge base from reflection is slightly different. And this is going to be more about how we gain knowledge through introspection, right? You look inside yourself by understanding experiences and seeing how you respond to outside stimuli. So it's not necessarily that there is some sensation that you experience. Instead, you experience a sensation and then you respond in a certain way, perhaps having emotions, perhaps becoming fearful or loving, gaining a sense of hope or doubt. And these become more abstract ideas that we gain, um, and we start to understand the world um, unless through our senses, but by taking our senses and then reflecting and just looking in ourself to understand what's happening or to see what's happening. And so when we use sensation and reflection to experience the world, we start to acquire ideas about the world. And we start to think of knowledge as that relation of ideas. So with the Empiricist originally makes the claim of knowledge originates in experience. What we can see by that phrase is really that ideas come from experience. They're not necessarily innate. And it's those ideas that provide us with a sense of knowledge about the world. And some of these ideas are things that perhaps don't necessarily need empirical verification. This is where our rational argument and our ability to rationalize comes in. We can take these certain ideas that we have and really understand how they relate to other things. And this is kind of where Descartes gets that principle of sufficient reason, right? By seeing that everything has a cause, or experiencing everything is having a cause, he can then from there rationalize this idea, well, if this thing needs a cause, and that thing needs a cause, and this thing needs a cause, then we can gain an understanding of this principle of sufficient reason. We can also start to understand the scientific or laws of physics, where we can recreate these laws or rationalities that we understand to be true and hold true all the time. For instance, we can look at Leibniz's law of non-contradiction. Uh, Leibniz suggests that nothing can be and not be at the same time, and this is something that we can sort of rationalize through our understanding of concepts and ideas, right? Understanding that if something were to exist, then by definition it couldn't not exist. And if something didn't exist, then by definition it couldn't exist. And now we can rationalize this idea and understand this idea about the world, but this isn't something that we could have understood without first understanding concepts. So you start to see where our knowledge comes from. Even though we can rationalize things, we first need to start to look at the world and understand how things begin to work. Now, for Locke, these ideas come in two primary forms. And get ready for lists in this lecture, because it seems as though Locke is the king of lists. He is just going to break everything down into categories. And when it comes to his ideas, uh, he's doing the same between simple and complex ideas. Simple ideas are going to be those ideas that are created through our experience with our senses. So again, through the sight, smell, touch, taste, um, things like sweetness or yellowness, weight, for instance. It's those types of somewhat constant ideas that we get about something. And then that's differentiated from complex ideas, which essentially are just made up of simple ideas. And so, an example perhaps of a complex idea would be a horse or regret. Um, it's not the case necessarily that you see a horse necessarily. Instead, you see something, let's say, brown, of a certain texture, of a certain height, weight, uh, and from that, you create an image or a concept that fits all of these different criteria and classify it as something else. So we would classify a brown, hairy, four-legged, carrot-eating animal as a horse. And so horse becomes a kind of complex idea made of those simple ideas. So from what we began with, that all knowledge originates in experience, really becomes uh, essentially that all ideas are simple or complex, and simple ideas are derived from sensation or reflection, and complex ideas are built from those simple ones. And as we think of complex ideas, we can also understand them in terms of the ideas that can really be broken into parts, broken into its simpler ideas, and really combine them in ways in which we can classify things and understand things in a more complicated sense, not necessarily just in terms of color or size or weight. We can really think of them in that more complex approach to what it is to feel regret, for instance, or what it is to understand what a university is. We couldn't necessarily say, oh, a university has this color or that color. It doesn't look or feel this way. It's essentially just understanding all the different pieces and how they're put together and relate to one another. And from those simple ideas, we end up getting a very complex one. So again, we see that there's this problem, however, with this understanding that we sense the world and reflect upon the world to create either simple ideas or complex ideas. But are those ideas actually the reality of the physical objects, or are they merely our experience of the physical objects? So, for instance, is our experience different from what is reality? So, is reality indistinguishable from our ideas? Are they the same thing? What you see is what you get, or is reality mainly based in our heads, in the ideas that we experience? Uh, think back to Berkeley and his understanding about what is real. What is real is our ideas, and instead of having this material world, really all we can understand from the world is what we can experience through sensations and reflections, and combining these simple ideas into more complex ones, so that we start to learn about the world, but only what we experience about the world, not necessarily about actual objects and what those objects are. And so for Locke, objects obviously have to exist separately from how they're perceived, because remember, because he's not setting the bar as high as Descartes, he's not going to want to claim that the world is identical to how we perceive the world. Um, Knowledge then would be much less certain and probably wouldn't even count for knowledge at that point. And so he's going to want to say that the objects must exist separately than how they're perceived. And so if objects are broken up separately from how they're perceived, we then need to break this understanding up into different types of qualities. And Locke's going to use primary and secondary qualities to really understand the actual world from the world that is perceived. Primary qualities are going to be those things that can be measured, such as shape, size, weight. The objective qualities, the things that um, cannot be thought to be different, versus things like secondary qualities, which are things like colors and taste, very subjective qualities, things that we all experience slightly differently. So when we think about primary qualities, we're really thinking of the innate quality of the things in the external world. So, uh, when, for instance, we look at an apple, we get the shape, we get a weight. Let's say it's 100 grams, it's shaped in this way, and this is largely objective in nature. It's always going to be 100 grams. If I weigh it at 100 grams, then it's going to be the same weight. If someone in a different country weighs it, or it'll be the same shape roughly. And so these primary qualities are going to be the qualities that are within the object. They're primary, they are actual qualities. And so these things are going to be essentially representative of the actual object. So, for instance, when we experience an apple, we get a representation of a weight, right? We get this mental representation. And this mental representation we see has roughly the same quality as the actual object, right? I experience the weight of this object as being 100 grams. this thing is 100 grams. I experience it as being this size and taking up this amount of space. And I can for certain say that, well, an apple roughly is that size and takes up this amount of space. Again, it's not it's not open for debate, these primary qualities. They happen to be the representative qualities of what is actually part of the world. Distinguish this from the secondary qualities, the qualities that are based on the primary qualities, but appear to us through sensation. Now, take for instance the color of something. We know that color is not necessarily something that is objective in nature and is largely open to debate in terms of who's experiencing it, who's sensing it, and so forth. It's been known that women, for instance, have a better sense of the color spectrum than men. And so a woman might experience the color of something in a slightly different way than a man will. Now, if this is the case, then what the apple is representing to us may not be representative of how that apple actually is. Again, think about how we scientifically understand color to be. Right? So first off, we have a woman that may experience the color as something slightly different than a man, but even the color, for instance, is light waves that are being reflected off of the object and then being caught by our eye. Now, we're not experiencing these waves. We can't actually see the waves. Instead, we see uh, this color coming off of the apple. And so this color isn't necessarily going to be part of the apple, but how we relate to the apple. And so these secondary qualities are uh, the things that we can base on the perceiver, base on the subjective viewer, and so forth. Now, when we're thinking about how an object is being represented to us, we start to see these ideas of qualities represent the qualities of objects to the mind. And what that means is, once again, our ideas about an object are simply what is represented to us from the object. And so it's really the mind gaining an understanding of the qualities through sensation, uh, through these simple ideas of then reflection, perhaps, or combining simple ideas. We're not really directly aware of the actual object. Instead, all we're directly aware of is the ideas that are perceived by the perceiver of the qualities of the object. And so we, as a perceiver, are we're what's the word I'm looking for? We are removed from what the object actually is. So when we see something, we're not actually seeing the object necessarily for what it is. We're seeing an idea of the object as it's perceived by us. So our awareness of objects in the world are really indirect. They're not directly relatable to those objects in themselves. And so for Locke, that means that our knowledge is of three kinds, really. We have the knowledge, or we gain the knowledge through reflection, through being intuitive. We gain it demonstratively uh, through reason, and then we gain knowledge through the sensation. And so we'll touch on each of these three kinds of knowledge for Locke. So intuitive knowledge is going to be that knowledge, that experience of knowledge that we get through the type of reflection of our own thought. We understand ourselves. This is where Descartes gets his cogito, I think, therefore I am. I'm as directly aware of the thinker as I am of the thought, right? Reflecting back in on oneself. These are the types of pieces of knowledge that obviously there still needs a perceiver to be any type of understanding of our ideas, but this is something that kind of can come to us through just looking inside oneself. Demonstrative knowledge is going to be instead that knowledge of basic laws or understandings of the world that we can come up rationally through rationality. Um, for instance, the idea if A is greater than B and B is greater than C, A must be greater than C. We know this logically, we know this rationally, and we can therefore uh, reason our way to understanding certain aspects about the world. Now, again, for Locke, even though that we have this demonstrative knowledge based on reason, this reason is still going to be largely understood only through our experience of how things relate to one another and so forth. It's how Descartes got to his understanding of God in last week's reading, and it's how we learn other types of scientific laws. Lastly is sensitive knowledge, and this is going to be that knowledge that we gain through experience. This is going to be how we know the existence of the material world, for instance, which has been the large part of this discussion already. That we understand the material world through our ideas of sensation and reflection, by ideas, by understanding the secondary and primary qualities of a thing that create um, simple ideas and things that we can form into complex ideas. Now, the problem with Locke's understanding of knowledge, especially when it comes to sensitive knowledge about the material world and our understanding of ideas, as expressed in the beginning of the lecture, is that essentially a skeptic is going to argue that what we actually know about the world uh, isn't actually true, and instead we're just perceiving aspects of the world. We understand our ideas, but these ideas don't necessarily match up to the real world. Um, so when we're looking at primary and secondary qualities, we see that we're indirectly perceiving an object. The skeptic may say, well, if you're indirectly perceiving the object, how does one actually then know anything about the object if all you're really perceiving are these qualities that are based on your sensation that aren't actually within the object? And Locke has essentially a threefold response to this. He's going to explain different degrees of knowledge and an involuntary defense um, through how we're sensing information, and then really just pragmatically defending his assumptions uh, through a type of pragmatic defense. And we'll look at each one of these in turn. So beginning with the degrees of knowledge, when we think about the material world, again, we're not holding the bar as high as Descartes. We are understanding that our knowledge is limited in a sense, and that when it comes to knowing, it may be the case that we just can't ever know directly about the material world. All we can be thought, or all that we can really ask, is to just know whether or not what the world is. Like, for instance, all I can really all I can really be asked to know is how the world works around me. I know how bridges are built. I know how mirrors work. I know how airplanes can fly. I know these things about the world. Whether or not they're indicative of how the world actually is, it doesn't really matter. For me, this stuff counts as knowledge, even if it isn't actually knowledge. If we were to be looking at, let's say, the world of the Matrix, for instance, and I'm in the Matrix, so I'm living my life in the Matrix. Me knowing how to get by, how to do things within the Matrix, that is knowledge, and it's to a lesser degree. I don't need to necessarily know what it's like to be outside of the Matrix, in the actual world for the Matrix. Instead, just being part of the Matrix and knowing how to get by and what it is to go about my day, or know what a hat is, or know what um, a dolphin looks like, right? These are things that are knowledge to me. And so, while this seems perhaps a little bit more intuitive uh, as an understanding of knowledge, it doesn't really actually get us to what is true or what is real. It just kind of, I don't know, it just kind of gets out of the problem by saying, oh, yeah, it's too hard to understand the world to that level. Let's just understand it to this lesser degree and cut our losses. Locke also provides the involuntary defense of our understanding of knowledge and how we can really understand the material world, uh, by the idea that some ideas impress themselves on us, so that essentially we're passive participants in understanding the world. And so when it comes to the case that when I look at an apple, for instance, because I can't choose perhaps what color the apple is, uh, in essence, that apple um, impresses its color on me, right? Because I'm a blank slate, I'm really a passive participant in how I acquire certain aspects, or certain ideas, particularly those primary qualities of objects. And so, if I'm a passive participant, then there must be something outside of us that actually causes them to impress this idea. So there's something within an apple that must exist to impress this idea on me of color or weight or size. And because that's the case, I can understand that there is this connection between the external world and the world in which I perceive. This, however, is probably not going to be the best defense against the skeptic, because the skeptic may still come back with a comment of, well, how do you know necessarily that something matches up to your idea of the external world? So even though this idea is impressed upon me by the apple, and I know that there's an actual object out there doing the work, how is it that I know necessarily that my perception of that apple accurately matches the objective nature of that apple? Lastly is the pragmatic defense. And the pragmatic defense for Locke, it essentially is probably one of the better defenses. And that's going to be essentially that even a skeptic who would suggest that we don't know anything about the external world isn't going to pragmatically act as though we don't understand anything about the world. So, for instance, go back to the image you have of Descartes rationalizing about the world in his study. He has a big, old school kind of chair, a fire on one wall, a fire in a fireplace, right? Maybe a couple bookshelves with books around him. Now, if we were being skeptical about what we knew of the external world, then surely Descartes would have no quarrel with the idea of walking over to the fireplace and sticking his hand in the fire. But of course, he's not going to do that. And even if he's being as skeptical as humanly possible, he's still going to refuse to stick his hand in the fire because there's something in him that knows what's going to happen if he does. And so, because the pragmatic person, or because the skeptic won't practice what they preach, as it were, then surely that shows that there's something to be known about the actual world and the world of what we perceive. Because if the world was something different than what we perceived, then the skeptic would have no problem in doing things that may essentially harm one or harm them. While Locke seems to adequately defend himself against the skeptic, and really make a pretty decent case for how we understand the world, or how we are considered to gain knowledge, or define what knowledge is. There's a big problem that seems to kind of follow him throughout his entire um, description of what knowledge is. And essentially, it's that it's unclear that he can really explain um, how some of our ideas are independent of the real world, and that we have knowledge when our ideas resemble that world. So what that means essentially is that if all of our knowledge originates in ideas that we gain about the world, how clear can we be in an understanding of the world? I mean, if we're handicapped to begin with by acknowledging that the world is not the thing that we're actually going to have knowledge about, but instead we are going to understand the world through our ideas, what makes us so sure that these ideas match up to the world? Again, our senses are often tricked. Our ability to rationalize is constantly challenged. We seem to uh, use and eat and drink substances that changes the ways in which we perceive the world, or take medicines that change in which we sense certain things about the world. And so if we're only able to ever acquire ideas about the world, why is it that we can be so certain that those ideas are good enough to explain, or accurately can explain, the actual world around us? Can we even know that there is an external world out there that we can really perceive, or are we going back to Berkeley and just gaining these ideas about the world and not necessarily knowing that there is a world out there? Could we all just be, for instance, the thought or experience or glimmer of God? Or is there actually a material physical world out there? And is our perception of that world a good representation of how the actual world is? So skeptics like Hume are going to essentially say no. And then from Hume, you get writers like Kant who come back and say, well, it may be a little both of rationality and experiences of the world. We seem to learn things uh, a priori as well as a posteriori. Um, and yet, it seems as though no matter what we experience under this empiricist position, we're always going to have the skeptic right at our side, expressing skepticism if our experiences can match up to the world and how we can explain that for certain. I mean, does this even count for knowledge? Locke stated at the beginning that knowledge is not quite that thing that Descartes was after, and that we really couldn't understand the actual world completely anyway. So I'm just going to lower the bar so that when I say that I know something, really it just means this kind of, well, I know this thing to a lesser degree. I don't know it necessarily for certain. It's just I know it well enough to get by in the world. Would you consider that this is a good enough explanation of knowledge?